Would you say that this sort of push, both from the popular movements and from people like Morales, this whole idea that, you know, the natural resources of the country should be nationalized because the wealth generated from that can be used to improve the country, you know, for the benefit of Bolivians. Would you say that that's just is more ideologically driven amongst people, or is that just because people just sort of have this sort of general sense that that's a fundamental right, or it just makes sense to use the wealth of the country to improve the status of people living in the country?
I think a lot of it has to do with ideology. The history of socialism in Bolivia is very strong, particularly among miners and very powerful militant unions and political parties that are very much about state control of resources and developing a socialist government, and Evo is an example of that. And that these kind of directions date back to particularly the revolution of 1952, when natural resources were privatized, or sorry, were nationalized, put under state control in the mining industry. And Bolivia's gas reserves have gone under private and state control off and on over the past century. And when Standard Oil was in Bolivia in the 30s, their activities were infamous among Bolivians. They illegally exported gas through illegally constructed ducts to Argentina without paying taxes, and they played a heavy role in instigating the Chaco War in Bolivia, which many Bolivians died in, and it was a war over oil and gas with the Dutch company Royal Shell, I believe, in Paraguay. So that's the kind of infamous history of corporate control that still people have a very clear understanding and memory of that when they're demanding state control of resources. And so there's that history, and there's also the, as you mentioned, the kind of basic understanding of this wealth should be used for our benefit, not for the benefit of gringos or Brazilians, or, you know, we're here in El Alto fighting to survive. Why don't we have direct gas connections to our homes when the gas is underneath our feet? Why should we be selling it to the U.S. or to Argentine companies for a low price when we can benefit from this? And it's the same case with the water in Cochabamba. Why should Bechtel make money when the water's right here for us to drink? And that's the basic conflict, I think, happening.
You brought up a parallel to kind of what's happening there, of something similar, even though the dynamics might be slightly different. What's happening even in Michigan, that, you know, that it's probably important for people to think about with water issues. Could you just talk about sort of how Bolivia's struggle is in many ways not very different than potentially our own struggle?
Yeah, I was talking in Michigan last spring, and along with some water activists, in Detroit last spring, and some water activists there, talking about the fact that Nestle and the bottling company here in Michigan have they're having cheap access to water in Michigan, while residents of Detroit can't even afford their own water bills. So it's very similar. Companies are coming in and saying, "Well, we're going to buy up all your water. We're going to make the distribution more efficient." And the fact is that most of the time profit is the only concern, and many poor families go without water. And the last number that I read was that 40,000 families in Detroit have gone without water regularly because of these increase in rates, when there's huge access to fresh water right nearby, and it's very similar to Bolivian gas. And seeing these kind of connections across borders, I think, is important for activists and students and just citizens of the world to see that in many cases the same systems of exploitation are disenfranchising people across borders, and seeing in many cases that sometimes it's the same company, Bechtel, reconstructing, quote-unquote, reconstructing New Orleans, working in Iraq. It's the same company that was working in Cochabamba in 1999 and 2000. And realizing that in many cases, citizens across borders have the same enemy, corporate CEOs, and unifying through that. And also, I think, taking the lead from Bolivian activists is important. In my book, I talk a lot about their amazing strategies for social change. And in the U.S., I think there can be a lot of lessons to be learned from organizing blockades and organizing around these fundamental issues of survival and radical change. And I think that U.S. citizens can have a lot to learn from that example in Bolivia.
And just maybe one last thing you mentioned in your book, and gave an example yesterday. You played a video that there's a pretty lively kind of popular movement, hip hop movement within in Bolivia, but also has sort of its roots in some ways in kind of the indigenous identity. Could you just sort of speak to that and maybe how that sort of what role that plays in the popular struggle?
Yeah, there's a group called Huayna Rap and Ucamahuique, different groups in El Alto, city above La Paz, a relatively poor city, working class city that's been very radical in recent years in mobilizations for control of access to natural resources. And Abraham Bojorquez is a friend of mine and a major character in the book in various chapters. He's an incredible activist, musician, and he's a member of a group that incorporates indigenous musical styles, Indian instruments, drums, flutes, and mixes it with kind of modern hip-hop beats, and they rap about the need for social change, the need for recuperation of natural resources, indigenous rights, and in a lot of ways they represent this revolutionary fervor in El Alto, in this new generation of activists that are they're resisting police repression in El Alto and are kind of at the front lines of the most powerful social movements in Latin America. And this hip-hop movement is increasing rapidly, primarily in El Alto, not widely across Bolivia, but in El Alto it's having a particularly big impact on the on political consciousness and kind of radicalizing young people in El Alto.
If people wanted to get more information about kind of current ongoing struggles in Bolivia, you have a website or websites you would suggest people want to get information to stay up informed?
Yeah, I mean, well, more information about the book, boliviabook.com. Easy to remember. And the website I edit on Latin American news, upsidedownworld.org. We have regular news from Bolivia and elsewhere in Latin America, and regularly either make our own reports or reprint from some of the best news sources on Bolivia there on Upside Down World.
Does that title come from the Uruguayan writer Eduardo Galeano?
Yeah, I mean, it's right from him, and so much of major themes in the book also have their roots in his analysis.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks for joining us, Ben.
Thanks a lot for having me.